Hey everyone, welcome to this final message in our teaching series that we've been doing during the month of February at C3 Wollondilly, Camden, called Disciple. And this message is intended to be used within a connect group where at the end of this message you'll be able to discuss things and pray for one another and support one another. Now, if you're not in a connect group and you're watching this, let me encourage you to get involved in one. Connect groups happen outside of Sunday services. Once a fortnight, you get together with a smaller group of believers and encourage one another and support one another. And if you're not in a connect group and you'd like to be, there's all kinds of options for you to get involved in. Come chat with me on a Sunday and I'll point you to the respective leader in the particular campus that you're at that will be able to help you get connected. Well, a brief review of where we've gone so far in this series. I'll try and condense this into 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll unpack today's part of the message. The very first Sunday we preached about this theme. We talked about what it means to be a disciple. We clarified the definition of a disciple and the mandate of the church to make disciples. We said that a disciple, as laid out in Scripture, is more than just a person who considers themselves a Christian and just says, yeah, I'm a Christian. A disciple is someone who is disciplined in their following of Christ. In fact, the word disciple comes from the same root word we get discipline. Jesus says things like, if you want to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. Jesus talks about sacrifice and laying down your own will and living for him and obeying him. All these kind of things are definitions of what it means to be a disciple. And our job is to do that ourselves, to follow Christ and to make followers of Christ. And in our first Connect group discussion message, we talked about the 5 stages of discipleship wheel, where it outlines the process that every believer goes through as they mature in their faith, from being dead in their sins, not yet born again, to becoming a new believer and heading into infancy and then into childhood and then into young adulthood and ultimately into parenthood, where we are reproducing ourselves and reproducing other disciples. And we explained how that process is for every one of us and how we can recognize people at different stages. We also said that it's good for us to assess ourselves and say, well, where am I in my maturity process? People tend to rate themselves higher than they actually are. People often think that their parents, they're at the final stage of maturity. But the best way to tell if you're at the final stage of maturity is, are you effectively discipling other people? Because if you can't point to people in your life that you're discipling and you're raising and you're growing and seeing them grow, then chances are you're not as mature as you'd like to think you are. And our goal as believers is to learn to mature. And then in our previous Sunday message, we talked about the 4, relational environments that we need to be involved in if we are to mature. We talked about the large public gathering, which is like our Presence Conference. It's like large conferences. The small public gatherings, which are our Sunday church services that happen every week, not once a month or once every 6 weeks, but every week there's a small public gathering. Our next one's called our small group or our connect group. These happen fortnightly. And fourthly, an intensive relational environment where there's someone in your life that you're looking to, maybe personally or with 2 or 3 others that also you're being discipled by. You're in an intensive relational environment or you're leading other people in an intensive relational environment. And we showed how you can't have one without the other. In fact, all 4 of these relational environments are necessary to grow. That is to say, there are things that happen in conference environment, in the large public gathering, that will grow you that you won't get in any other of those 3 environments. And the same for any one of them. Hence, you need to make sure that you're in all 4 of those regularly and consistently. This session, I want to talk about how we can actually play out our growth. How can we measure it and see growth, the maturity of the Christian life, affecting and improving, our day-to-day life. And the book Discipleship mentions 3 ways that our lives should be affected if we're maturing. And it's a little bit coy, but they talk about head, heart, and hands. Head refers to our knowledge. Are we growing in our knowledge and understanding of our faith? Our heart is our character and our attitudes. Are we changing our attitudes and our behaviors? Are they manifesting change and improvement as a result of our being discipled by Christ. And lastly, our hands, that speaks of reaching out and serving others and helping in the world. Are others outside of ourselves being helped by our growth? And so head, heart, and hands. And we should be able to point to all three of those as improving if we are being discipled. And alongside those three, head, heart, and hands, the book also talks about 4 spheres. And I talked about this in our email devotion last week that I sent you. 4 spheres of growth that we should be able to measure ourselves in. The first one being our relationship with God directly, our sphere of our own personal relationship with God. Secondly, our sphere of our relationship to His church. How are we relating to the church around us, our connect group, our Sunday services, and so on. Thirdly was our relationship in our home, our family, our relationship with our parents, our kids, our spouses, and so on. Stuff that happens in the home. And fourthly, our relationship with the wider world outside, the world that we interact with who aren't believers, who aren't in the church, who aren't in our home. And we should be able to track improvement in our head, our heart, and our hands in each of those 4 spheres. The sphere of our relationship to God, the sphere of our relationship to our church, the sphere of our relationship to our family, and the sphere of our relationship to the wider world. And so I want to examine each of those. And the book Discipleship does this particular examination within the context of the book of Ephesians. If you watched the video last week, I would recommend that you read the book of Ephesians. If you haven't read that as a group and you've got time and there's time in your discussion, I would even recommend that you switch the video off for a few moments and read the book of Ephesians. It'll take you about 20 minutes to read the whole thing. If you've got time for that, it'll be worth it. You'll get a better understanding of where I'm going to go in the next few minutes of this teaching. So first I want to talk about our relationship with God in context of our head, our heart, and our hands, and we'll do this for each of the 4 spheres. So our relationship with God is our highest priority. Before we put anything else into perspective, we have to have a relationship with God. If we just relate to the church, we're not going to grow in our faith. Lots of people come to church, but they don't have a relationship with God. It has to be priority number 1. And in the book of Ephesians, Paul spends the first 2 chapters specifically dealing with our personal relationship to God. He reminds us that we've been chosen by God, appointed by Him before the beginning of the world. You belong to Him. He reminds us that we are seated with Christ in heavenly places. You and I, if we're followers of Christ, have an availability of an incredible power from heaven that comes from a dynamic, vibrant relationship with Christ, where we actually are seated alongside Him in heavenly places. There's a great book, a famous old book called Sit, Walk, Stand by Watchman Nee. And he talks about the book of Ephesians as well, and he explains that the book of Ephesians is laid out like sit, walk, stand. If you want to be a believer and effective in your relationship with Christ, first you need to understand that you're seated with Christ, that what authority is available to you through your relationship with Him. And then you can begin to walk out your faith in these spheres, your family life, your church life, your home life, your community outside. And then lastly, stand. Ephesians chapter 6 talks about standing against the enemy. Sit, walk, stand. Great book. Just an aside that might be worth looking at. And Paul prays that in Ephesians 1:18 that believers would have eyes to see all this, that they would understand how much power is available to them who believe. Now, in the context of our sphere of our relationship with God, the book talks about head, heart, and hands. And it says, to evaluate, are we growing in our head? We need to say, well, are we actually growing in our understanding of God? Are we applying God? Are we learning about God? It's not that learning is everything. It's just that we do need to learn. We do need to grow in our understanding of God. We need to be reading His Bible regularly. That's why we're doing the Bible reading plan, encouraging you as a church to do Project 345, a simple Bible reading program on the YouVersion Bible app, which just gets you through the New Testament once a year. It takes about average of 3 minutes and 45 seconds a day on average, not a massive amount of time, to get you through the New Testament once a year. And that would be like a benchmark minimum that we would encourage you to do, to read the Bible. You have to have a prayer and devotional life. You need to be in relationship with God so you can talk to Him. You need to get more knowledge from being in connect group discussions. Some of the best growth you will have as a believer takes place when you switch this video off and you begin to talk as a group and discuss. They're all ways that you can grow in your head knowledge, if you like, of your relationship with God. Then there's the heart relationship with God. In other words, if you're maturing in your sphere of your God relationship, then you should be able to see yourself evidence of character growth and behavior change in your life. If there's none, then chances are you're not growing. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 to 25, it says, I say, let the Holy Spirit guide your lives, then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. And the Spirit gives us desires that are opposite to what the sinful nature desires. These two forces are constantly fighting each other, so you're not free to carry out your good intentions. But when you're directed by the Spirit, comes through cultivating intimacy with Him. That comes through the head stuff, by being involved in relationship with Him and with Connect Group and so on. When you are directed by the Spirit, you're not under obligation to the law of Moses. When you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. As if that's a pretty exhaustive list right there. He's saying when you live by the Spirit, you won't do those things. When you live by the flesh, when you don't have a relationship with God, these things will be naturally part of your life. But he says, but let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone having this sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the Holy Spirit produces a different kind of fruit. It's natural. Fruit is a natural byproduct. When you're in relationship with God, these things should be happening in your life. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Paul is saying, if you're in relationship with God, maturing in your knowledge of Him, these behaviors will flow out of your heart. You will naturally become more loving, more joyful, more peaceful, more patient, more kind, and so on. And lastly, our hands. If we are in a relationship with Jesus, we should becoming, and we should be able to see that we're becoming increasingly aware and more passionate about serving other people, both people in the church and people outside the church. In other words, are you actually demonstrating your relationship with God by the way you relate to other people? So that's sphere number one, our relationship with God. Secondly, our relationship to the church. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul turns to this and he talks about this relationship to the church in depth. He explains that you can't be a follower if you're not in relationship with other believers. It's part and parcel of being a disciple of Christ. He explains that we should be living in unity with other believers. We shouldn't be angry with them, he says. And he talks about how to live a kind life toward one another. Be kind and not abusive to others, etc. How do we do that in context of our head, heart, and hands? How are we growing in our knowledge of the church? Well, if we're growing in our head knowledge of the church, we should be growing in our understanding that we're required to be in relationship. A less mature person says, I don't need the church. It's there for me. It suits me. I come when I want. I don't need to be there. I can get by without it. But if we're maturing in our knowledge, we're understanding that we do need the church. And just as importantly, the church needs you. And we have something to contribute to the church. We understand that we're not permitted to actually live apart from the church. Nowhere in the Bible does God say it's okay, don't worry about being involved in the church. It's actually necessary to be in community and interact in community with other people. In our heart relationship to the church, we should be able to look to ourselves and see that we're growing in character in this area. And it should be coming from our desire to want to love the church. I want to be in church. The excitement factor about being in church and being able to be a blessing and encouragement to other people. Our hands, can we provide demonstrative proof that we are actually increasing in our relationship with the church? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? Did we used to serve and we don't serve anymore? Because if we do that, we're not maturing, we're going backwards. We should be able to show we are serving, we are committed regularly, we are relating to others, beyond just occasionally showing up on a Sunday, beyond just serving when it suits me and when I get something out of it. We're maturing, we're serving God's church even when it doesn't suit us, even when it's inconvenient, because we're prioritizing His church. And thirdly, our relationship at home. And this is dealt with in Ephesians chapters 5 and 6. And Paul probably saves the best or even probably the hardest to last, because I've met lots of people who can fool other people into thinking they're doing really well in their maturity, but ask their spouse or ask their children, and not so much. In fact, this is the area of life where many people who look like they have it all together ultimately come unstuck because they haven't matured in this area. And Paul talks about this. This is your relationship with your spouse and your kids and your parents and so on. And in the context of head knowledge and growing in an understanding, a maturing disciple will begin to understand the importance of family in God's eyes. They don't just dismiss family and go, I'm just doing church, I don't care about my family. I just work, I don't care about my family. No, they understand that family is important to God. God has placed us in families, and we are responsible, if we're parents, to raise our kids, not to ignore them. It's not all well and good to go and do all the other stuff, but if we're not prioritizing our family at a high level, then we're not growing in our understanding, in our head knowledge of this. In fact, the family unit predates any other institution, predates church and work and everything else. Family was the first institution that God ordained. Adam and Eve in the garden, family. And it's high priority to God. Within the context of our heart, is our character and behavior being positively affected as a disciple of Jesus? Are you demonstrating change in your family? See, your family will generally see the stuff that doesn't come out in public because you can't hide it. And so a good litmus test is what would your spouse or your parents or your children say about you? What would they say about your behavior in the home life? Ask yourself that, because that's ultimately proof if you're growing in the sphere of family, if you're maturing in the sphere of family. And hands, how are you actually doing this? Are you maturing? Do you serve and lay down your life for other members of your family? Or is your expectation that they do that for you? A maturing believer within the sphere of their family should be able to say, look at themselves and say, I see evidence where I actually serve my kids, where I serve my spouse. Not where they serve me, not where they're there to exist for me, but I lay down my life to serve them. That is a maturing believer, a definition of a maturing believer within the sphere of family. And finally, the sphere of the world around you, the fourth sphere. And towards the end of chapter 6, Paul begins to address this sphere. And he does it within the context of talking about relationships between slaves and masters. And I guess today we could talk about employees and employers, but it's more than that. It's about, ultimately, it infers all relationships that exist outside of family and the church. So any other human relationships that we have. And we need to also examine that within the context of head, heart, and hands to see if we're growing. So with regard to our growing of our understanding, ask yourself, are you growing in your understanding that you have a responsibility to interact with the world around you? See, lots of believers think they don't want anything to do with the world. They just want to separate themselves from the world. They don't talk to anybody at work. They don't communicate with their neighbours. They don't think that's important. In fact, some believers think that's wrong to do that. But Jesus said, I want you to go into the world. Not come out of the world, but go into the world. Go out into all the world and make disciples. Jesus says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. So we're supposed to be in the world. We're just not supposed to be living like the world. And so a maturing believer in this area actually understands the importance of being, existing, having relationship with people outside of the church and their family. Their heart. If you want to examine your heart, you need to ask questions like this to see if you're maturing in the heart area. Do I actually have a love for lost people? Or don't I care about them? Because if you're maturing in your relationship to the sphere of the world, then you'll be developing a passion and a love for people, a concern, a care for people who aren't in relationship with God. Do you have a desire on the inside to build relationship and friendship with them? Or are you just not interested? Because if you're not interested, you're not growing in this area. We're not called to bunker down and wait till Jesus comes back. We're told to go out there and make relationships. And in the relationship, in respect of your hands, you need to ask yourself, am I actually going? Am I actually building relationship with my neighbours and people in my workplace? Do I target those relationships to build them, no strings attached? Not so that I can get a bum on a seat in church, but no strings attached, but ultimately with the goal of being able to share God's love, the message of the gospel, with them. And that's such an important topic, in fact, that we're actually going to spend another entire series between now and Easter called the E word. We're going to focus on that dreaded E word, the word evangelism, and we're going to empower us and equip us to be able to get out there into the world, build relationship, and ultimately share the good news with people, and hopefully, prayerfully, see some come to Christ. Well, your discussion questions are before you. You don't need to go through every one of these discussion questions in your Connect group. They'll be in the YouVersion Live notes attached to this as well. But they're there as a starter if you like. If you get through them all, great. But don't feel like you have to get through them. They're just there to promote discussion. I'm more concerned about you guys getting into discussion environments where you can unpack this stuff and support one another and actually apply it to your life. All right, God bless you. It's been great being with you during this series. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday when we start our brand new series called The E Word. See you then, church.